Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Dhaka Art Summit and to MAHASSA for putting together this panel. In thinking about the art school, some of the questions that I'm interested in posing are, how do we, in writing these histories, situate the art school within the broader field of artistic and cultural production, not just within the specific cities within which these sort of schools were based or located, but also really for the ways in which the schools became a site of world building. And I'll elaborate on this in a bit. Some of the other questions are, for instance, from and since the time of their inception, what have been the changing visions for the school and for the field, and how do these find articulation through the individuals who taught and studied there? What new infrastructures of knowledge did the art school innovate or provide? What imaginaries of the artist do they produce? In other words, what are the catalytic roles that art schools have performed thus far, or carry within them the potential to perform? The images that you're seeing here are of plates from the archives of the Art History Department in the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda. The institution was set up in 1950, so soon after Indian independence, very much part of the sort of institution building efforts of sort of the new state, where culture was sort of positioned in very specific ways. You had on the one hand pre-modern or traditional arts and forms of culture, which were positioned, I mean, and they were meant to sort of stand as repositories of civilizational wealth and so on. And on the other hand, of modernist practice as holding immense promise for the nation's future. So the Faculty of Fine Arts was set up with a mandate that also coincided with the professionalization of the field itself, the field of art, including but not limited to the figure of the artist. This was the first art school in India to offer a degree in the arts, and one that was also affiliated to a university, right? Prior to that, you had art schools that offered diplomas, for instance. Its curriculum strove to be distinct from what it saw as sort of the academic training of the colonial art schools. So for instance, the J.J. School of Art in Bombay, and perhaps the vocationalism or the sort of indigenous streak of Santiniketan, while at the same time drawing from both, right? And as a resoundingly modern institution, it drew in students from all parts of India, but also from around the world, particularly from South Asia. And in that sense, it was informed by the, you know, sort of the individuals who sort of traveled to this place as well. What I wanted to share today are sort of I'll just focus on sort of two models of learning and teaching from Baroda that I think would be interesting for this audience here. The first, of course, is the Archive and Documentation Center of the Art History Department. One of the things that's very peculiar about the sort of art history department was that art history was taught in Baroda before the department itself was set up. And so you had all these artists who were primarily actually, I mean, you know, teaching painting or sculpture and so on, who would take lessons in art history for students who were also, you know, in a sense, essentially practice-based students. And then it was eventually a few years down that you had a department of art history that was set up with the headship of Professor Ratan Parimu. And the story of how this archive actually at the art history department came about is also quite an amazing one. So Professor Ratan Parimu went to the Courtauld Institute of Arts to study, and there he actually came across what we know as the image libraries at Courtauld, and which is where they basically collected or sort of images of artwork from periodicals. And this was a strategy that they adopted for arts of many places, particularly those that were difficult to sort of reach, right? How do you get access to artwork images from different parts of the world? And so in particular, I think what he was struck by at that time was how they gathered together images from sort of Soviet Russia. And he realized that the way that they did this was to actually order journals and cut images from these journals and paste them onto these plates and organize them at the Courtauld for use by students, by teachers, and so on. And this actually became the technique that he and other faculty members at Baroda adopted to put together the archives in the art history department. And just for reference, this is what the Courtauld image libraries look like. I've just grabbed these images off the internet. So, but I think what interests me about the archives is that they became a very significant pedagogical tool, right? This was the way in which people were sort of, looking at art, learning, teaching, etc. These get used within the classrooms on a day-to-day basis. They get used during seminars, etc., etc. And in that sense, the archives became a very significant teaching tool and learning resource. The other thing that also sort of connected interestingly, these are just a couple of letters in terms of how the archives were built. So if one of the stories goes that, and we have actually a letter from Ratan Parimu to the head librarian of the MS University of Baroda, where he says, we would like to order 3 copies of every issue of every magazine, and that he had listed. And he says, 1 will be kept in the library of the Faculty of Fine Arts, but the other 2, we will use them to cut up sort of these images and paste them. So why 2 copies? Because, in case images were printed on both sides, they would need 2 copies of these. And he said, do not be alarmed. Think of this as sort of in the way that chemists and faculty in the chemistry department order sort of chemicals and other things for their experiments and sort of which get destroyed and thrown away afterwards. Think of it as this. We're not sort of, destroying books over here. We're actually sort of constructing resources. And so what is also interesting is that apart from ordering these journals and so on to build this library, they also wrote to several sort of museums and artists and so on saying, look, this is something that we're building over here. Why don't you send us images of your artwork? Why don't you send us your bios, share your exhibition catalogs or details, send us your CVs. We will add all of this to the archive. And in that sense, what's interesting is when we unpack these archives of these individuals is that you really get to see how such an archive actually came together. Another sort of thing another way in which the archive was built was actually through the study tour. So the faculty would on an annual basis carry out study tours to various parts of India. And so the images that I showed at the beginning were actually images that entered the archive through the study tours. So they would take annual tours, but also use those tours as a moment to document, right? And put those materials into the archive. And so one of the peculiar things that one would see in the Faculty of Fine Arts archive was if you're opening up a box on, say, Ajanta or Ellora, you will see multiple, you will see the decades through which they've documented the same, let's say, cave or something. And so from the really bad black and white photographs to now very sort of digital and high-res photographs. The other aspect, since I was talking about all these sites that I just briefly wanted to touch upon, was also that Because one of the areas of interest in art history at that time was to sort of look at Ajanta, Ellora, in thinking about, from questions of, when did these, when were these caves painted, when were these sculpted, etc. The art history department also held a lot of on-site seminars at these places. And so we have these amazing sort of photographs that show you how, and classes and so on were actually conducted on site itself. So I guess one of the points that I am sort of trying to make here is that how are our sort of ways of learning art history informed by the technologies through which we view art, right? So if today, we're viewing a lot of images on screen and, whether it's via the internet and so on, and in Baroda, even today, there is a way in which we've learned art history through sort of mechanical reproduction, right? There's entire generations of students of art who have not really had the privilege in a sense of seeing an original work of art. We've studied art history just by looking at reproductions, whether it's in journals, whether it's, anywhere else, like for generations in Baroda, it was actually just looking at the plates over there, or perhaps of 35 slides that the faculty would use in classrooms, and the same slides would be shown year after year, decade after decade, in spite of it changing colors. So there's often a running joke that somebody would be talking about Picasso's sort of blue paintings, and actually the slide would have sort of just turned pink, and one would still be saying, think about it, what must this have been like if it was blue? So anyway, and so what does it do to one's visual sense in a sense when these are the infrastructures of knowledge that we sort of use? And perhaps, and this is probably a little far-fetched, but that because using the archives became such an integral part of sort of learning experience in Baroda, it can perhaps sort of signal something to the fact that you had an interest in historical painting from the artists that emerged over there. But this is just, possibly kite flying. The second model that I wanted to talk about was the Fine Arts Fair. The idea for the Fine Arts Fair was introduced in Baroda by two artists, Shankar Chaudhary and K.G. Subramanian, and both of whom sort of drew this idea of the fair from Santiniketan. And what the fair became in Baroda was really this sort of, it was this extracurricular sort of moment of teaching and learning, where time would be set aside every year or every alternate year in order to sort of, so no studio practice, all of that would be suspended for a while, and students and faculty would together engage in making what was sort of craft or everyday art and so on. So from toys to puppets to masks to, just sort of theater plays, and all of these things would be sort of made and sold. And it was also one of the, sort of only times when the faculty would be opened up to the larger public, in a sense, where, people could enter the Faculty of Fine Arts in large numbers and look at what was being produced over there. And given that teachers like K.G. Subramanian, given that given their investment in the idea of the living traditions and so on, the Fine Arts Fair really became that site where they would experiment with whether it was methods of dyeing or terracotta or other materials that they may not usually sort of use in their regular classroom sort of teaching. So one of the other stories that is well known is that the artist Mrinalini Mukherjee first began her use of hemp actually in the Fine Arts Fair, and not really within the, within, let's say, the painting or mural department where she was a student. And so it really became this interesting site that saw the interface of art and craft, or perhaps everyday and high art, and was this sort of extracurricular sort of moment, and one that I think added a lot of depth and sort of value to back into the studio practice and so on of the art school. So I think I'm just going to end with this, and yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I'm a little bit nervous because I have heard, and I was just, I was watching all those panels for the last few days, and I saw so many huge and beautiful presentations. And also the panelists before me, they have shown beautiful presentations as well. So I am going to be like, stay in the initial level, and I'm going to talk about the rise of the schools, especially the history, and what was the psychology behind the schools who actually being two artists who actually started the schools in Bangladesh, in Dhaka and also in Chittagong. So first, I would like to show you something. And also, I would like to thank, first of all, I would like to thank Sandani Art Foundation for arranging such a beautiful, seminars and also the exhibitions. So the Art Summit is really beautiful. So first, I would like to show you one slide where I put myself, it's a time machine at me. And I would like to say that I want to actually go back to 1 year before, where if I could get time to get preparation for these, all these materials I've been through for the last 2 months actually, and I couldn't actually finish locating all those, and also there are lots of things which I have to see and I have to research to make more sure about what actually was happening at that time, what happened, and also how the schools and the pedagogy and also the education system actually running now in the country. That's so much quite related. So that's why I have put myself on the time machine, and I'm feeling that, okay, maybe, and also I'm thinking about if I could just pass away this time with the time machine, that would be also very much, I mean, helpful for me, because, you know, what happens, I would like to ask some questions to myself, and also the questions will go to the art world of Bangladesh, what was actually going on here. And I'm also, I want to ask questions about the gurus of fine arts of Bangladesh as well. The word gurus came because, you know, in my country, these two figures are so much important, and they have begun like Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, who once became like, yeah, he knows everything about the spirituality of the Indian soul. And also these persons are actually, we cannot say anything, we cannot criticize them, we cannot ask questions about them, because what they have actually started here still remains as their, what should I say, the propagation kind of thing which we have to follow in our schools. And it's so it's so strong here that still now we are actually fighting to change the curriculums of the schools. They have started when they have started the schools here. Okay, so I would just like to show you some slide which I can actually show you. It's like a time machine, and you can just go back and you can come back. We can come back. Like the history actually begins with, because these government Art University and also Government Art College and Craft in Kolkata, where actually Jainul Abidin then actually was educated from. And the syllabuses and curriculums also came from these schools. And why am I just putting this together? Because to show you that the Government College of Art and Crafts founded on August 16 in 1954, and also the Bishopbharati University is founded on 23rd December 1921. So when these schools were really established, when Jainul Abidin actually went for his education in Government College of Art and Craft, And why actually he went there. If I just want to refer his education, then I would like to say that I would like to refer actually Noguno Thengo's the theory, the colonization of the unconsciousness. And also I would like to refer to Fana and Menoni, and also the other theorists establish um, the theories who actually said about colonizations, and also who actually established the theory of theorization of unconsciousness of the colonizers. So this had said, all of you know more than me, because actually I want to go to the time machine and go back to from this year. It has two phases, actually, I was told. And it was like, there was a project of the colonizers who actually they wanted to rebuild the knowledge of the colonized, especially their history and the directions of their reality, because and it was not actually, it was not true, it was based on lies. And there was another phase which was like, they have another kind of what they were actually doing, what they did. They have circulated and they have spread that knowledge to dominate and establish the supremacy of the colonizer. And as a result, the colonized loses their self-confidence, their self-respect, as well as they feel inferior and become imitators. Why am I mentioning all this? Because at that time, when Jainul Abidin went to the school and he started his education at that time, it was like the decolonization was happening in Vishwabharati University, because we have seen that Rabindranath was actually his education system, how he was actually doing his work, his classes outside, and how he was actually incorporating the knowledges of the past, maybe the formats of Nalanda. Actually, I am not an expert. This is not my area of specialization. Maybe I will become, because yeah, I'm really interested. So maybe some of you knows better than this one, but let me just continue. So and also by E.B. Hebel and also Rabindranath and Nandalal Basu, already it was really famous and it was well known in that Kolkata and outside Kolkata, that the new Renaissance, the New Bengal School, and also the Indian spirituality, it was really famous and it was recognized. So Jainul could have, I mean, go to that university instead of Government College of Art and Craft. And because he went to his school at 1931. So why he went to 1854, why he went to the Government College of Art and Crafts? It was my question. And I found some answers from there, and it was written in another article of Sayyid Nizar Alam, who actually wrote about what happened actually at that time, why Jainul actually went to that art college instead of Vishwabharati. So it was like in his work, it's a great work, and it was done in Bangla, in Nibrigand, and I really like this article. So in his article, he wrote about that, and he was theorizing the decolonization of thoughts of Sultan in his work. So he said that after 1947 in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, you know, all of you know, the institutions and also in personal level, the decolonization we have witnessed through the movement of New Bengal School, Raja Ravi Morma, and also Shamachan Charan De, also New Bengal School, suddenly actually started to decrease here. He showed three reasons behind it. One, it was like influence of Muslim nationalism. So there was a story which was really very much cherished by all the art students, and we really love about Jainul Abidin, how his mother actually sold his necklace, gold necklace, and he went to Kolkata, and he's lived there in a very hardship and learned all those art, and also became really very good student. He stood first class first, and also when he was actually a student, he got actually offered, and he appointed as a teacher. So he was doing a lot of things at that time. And so I was thinking, why actually, what happened to a Muslim boy who actually, the Muslims were not actually allowed to go to learn art at that time. So why he actually started that? So actually, I found another reason that at that time, and also Nisar Hossain also, I will come back to that part later, but first let me see this one, why actually Jainul, being a Muslim, went to read art. So Nisar Hossain, actually in his art, pointed out that the situation of artistic development emerged in the colonized India, where the taste of appreciation of art was changing among the intellectuals, and as well as art and artists who were trying to find their way through the art education, which were actually Western art. And as Nisar Hossain quoted, the spread of secular education, the Western art was secular, art education was secular in this context at that time. And after being educated in this system, there arise an option to choose profession by own will and ability. The boundary of traditional racist and religious restrictions towards getting education are no longer remains. So suddenly all those restrictions were gone, and the Muslim family, a middle-class Muslim family can somehow allow one student to go there and read art and learning art. So somehow at that time, actually it happened because we come to know that there are some persons from Mymensingh who actually went to Kolkata and got educated in art schools, and they had very well-established career, because to name a few, it was Hemendra Nath, and also like Shashi Bhushan Hesh, and also Atul Basu. They were getting very good salary in some Raj Darbars, and also they were getting some prizes in the school, gold prizes and other prizes in the school, and also they're getting some scholarship from abroad to learn more about art. These things are happening, which actually was really attracted Jainul Abidin at that time to go to Kolkata to get that education. And also, but still, because there were all jobs, and also there were like so many art practitioners who were taking up, like Raja Ravi Murma, and they are really successful. So Jainul felt like there was a successful professional career where he can earn money, and also he can actually learn all those beautiful academic artwork from Western art, which was actually getting much more attraction to the people, and people were actually thinking at that time that, okay, only the education art from those realistic academic art or other artists, that kind of situation happened. And also we have seen all those illustrations of that time, which were actually very much popular in this Bengal. And there was one artist illustrator, Abul Qasim, who was actually drawing some really very much realistic drawings, and lots of young people who want to become artists were getting influence from those illustrations as well, and they were like academic works. So that is one of the reasons who actually, Janul actually led to Government Art College and Craft, or many reasons. Maybe I have to find more, and I have to get some documents as well afterwards, which I want to do. And I want to say another things like, okay, when in 1931 and till from 1931 till 2000, sorry, from 1931 till 1937, he was a student of that art college. And in 1938, he was appointed as a teacher. And we have all know about his works of that time, because especially his 43 artworks, where he actually drawn some feminine drawings, and it was really famous at that time. And before that, I want to go back again, like in 32 or 33, he has got one prize from the art college of he was doing one watercolor in realistic way, where he actually found and he got one prize for that one. But Mukulde, and also there are other teachers of him who were actually teaching him, and he was actually telling him about his origin, his traditional art. And also they were, especially Mukulde was really, he came from the New Bengal school, and he knew about the styles and New Bengal school's movement at that time. So Mukulde told him that to accumulate all those styles, but he remained very much fond of academic art of Western style. That is a question, why actually he was not taking the advices. And after that, but in fourth year, he has got another prize. And that in that prize, his style was like much more related to, we can relate him much more decolonizing processes, because he was incorporating the lines of the folk art, and also he was actually doing some, and also the washes, the gouache, they were getting different. So my question is like, as he has already was thinking about what the difference, and he knew, and he was in his artistic life, he was actually trying to achieve his own language, and it was kind of, as yesterday I heard about Harmanpura, that it was decolonized. So when he actually came after 47, it happened like the Muslim teachers and other Muslim artists, they were being asked because of the partition, that whether they can choose to stay in India or they can come back to the new East Pakistan if they want to. So Jarnabidin, and we know about Kamrul Hassan and Shafiuddin Ahmed, they have chosen to come back to East Pakistan. That is really something to very much enjoyable. What should I say? I forgot the word. It is really something important for the art movement of here, because at 1948, the first school here was established. You see, I just wrote the evaluation of the school here through the dates. So 1948, it was Dhaka Art School, and 1963, it became the East Pakistan College of Arts and Crafts. Actually, they had some disappointment as well, because when they came back in 1948, the situation was so different, because in Lahore, there was a school, like Amita Shergill was living there, and in Lahore, there was the education was also very, art education was also very rich, and also when he was in India, he was getting a lot of money, he was selling his works as well, and he was actually getting recognition. So when he came back in 47 here, At that time, the situation was so different from here. The government was not ready, the Muslim government, because of the Muslims has some kind of disagreements with art kind of thing. So this situation was really disappointing for him. But still, he and his friends, they struggled. I was about to put that struggling, very much iconic work of John Labidin here, but I didn't. It would be too much. That's why. But I want to show this one. This is really, though it happened not. It came like after Bagan Government College of Art and Crafts. It came here a few years back in Jegun Bagicha. And also Jainul Abidin was really busy with Mazharism. He was very young at the time and prominent to make this building happening. The one thing is, this building is also became iconic here because of the modern building. Also, the art world is also actually looking at this. I think this is one of, I took this picture as a metaphor of what actually our art world, art pedagogy and the syllabus is here. So it's really static and there's really established, and we want this to cherish, really cherish. It happens like this. So I want to go back again and a few things about, I will just finish, and about the psychology and the situation here, what actually made Jainul Abidin to choose the syllabuses of the art school, government art school, and also the pedagogy, and also the way actually the art movements and the arts and the students actually got educated. Just, it was a replica of the government art school and craft of Kolkata. So it was because influence of the Muslim nationalism was one of the reasons. Because after 1947, the conflict between modernism and the Bengal Renaissance took a new dimension here among the Bengal Muslims. They felt then a new challenge to solve the questions of religion, self-identity, and nationalism. In these circumstances, the artists from East Pakistan searched their inspiration from the history outside of India, like Middle East or the Western countries. And Jainul Abidin said once that we should accommodate knowledge from every good things of the world, not only from the heritage, not only from the traditions, but also we should open up ourselves and we should take everything, every good from the whole world of art. And number two, it was like the influence of Marxist politics in Dhaka because of it. Because in Dhaka, at that time, the Marxism actually was getting really worldwide acclamation. And in Dhaka, in Dhaka Art School, along with the artists, the Marxists and other okay. So the Marxist intellectuals are close, and they were having some addas and each day. So, and the Marxist ideology, they denied they denied the philosophy of Orientalism, and also they denied the spiritual notions of Abanindranath Thakur and the Bengal school. So they preferred the art of realism of British art school or Western academic art school, because, and it was already past 100 years here, so it can be really established here. Because it was much more straight and communicative, so that was one of the reasons why Jainul actually got convinced to keep in his syllabus live drawings, and also the formation of the syllabuses and is like very much came from the British schools. Actually he went to, in 52 and 53, he went to Slade School, and he brought more syllabuses from there, which he implied in the schools of Dhaka art in Dhaka here. So, and the third one, which I want to say, that the education in abroad, especially in Europe and Japan, by the artists of Dhaka. At that time, most of the artists, they were actually visiting in many places, and also they were getting the education of modern schools. So for these three reasons, actually here we have started, Janul have started, he was the visionary. Maybe he thought that there should be some amalgamation of Western and Eastern, or also the folk thing in the syllabuses, so that we can just, the art of Bangladesh can become very much individual, very much separated from the art of India. Somehow it was, he denied the past. I think it was like the inferiority of the colonized. That's the kind of thing in my, I'm still questioning, and I am still questioning. Okay, so the last thing, is it 15 minutes gone? Oh, I'm so sorry, because I have left Rashid Chaudhuri here, but and also the University of Chittagong, but maybe I cannot finish it. So I will just show you one thing. The Department of Fine Arts and University of Chittagong, it was introduced, subsidy subject in 1968, and in 1970, the University of Chittagong Department of Fine Arts established, and it has long story, long history, and as it was also established by one of the great student of Jainul Abidin, Rashid Chaudhuri. So Rashid Chaudhuri actually started the same syllabus, though he was actually, he took his education and he went to, he was really, he knew about the art movements, modern art movements, and also he was very fond of Bauhaus. And also that's how he wanted to make one kind of new kind of syllabus, which has applied arts and that kind of thing. And he was also a tapestry artist, and also he was much more inclined to the folk art as well. His style actually emerged from the folk art style. So the last thing, I'm going to finish. This is the Sonargaon Folk Art Museum. Why am I going to show you this picture? Because this is the thing actually, what actually came to me as the decolonization thinking of Jainul Abidin. Because when he started folk art festival in Dhaka Art College at that time, he knew that these are the things who actually identifies us, but he didn't have the courage to incorporate all those education in the syllabuses. And also, then he started doing, and also he visited various biennale. After coming back from biennale, there's one point that he actually thought that he didn't do the second exhibition of the annual show. He was really confused to show the artworks. And at that point, it occurred to me that he was actually thinking about the folk art. How could we put our folk art and also all those things in our research, in our syllabus? That's how in 1975, this museum actually he initiated. So last thing I want to say, and I know I said last thing lots of time, and this is the last time, yeah. So this is that slide again, because I really want to go back to the time machine and go back to that time when, maybe in 1930, and ask Jainul Abidin. then please come and get admitted yourself at Santiniketan. Maybe, or maybe you can actually rethink about how you're going to make the syllabus and how you should actually be more courageous and start a decolonizing thing here. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to my lecture.
Thank you, Sheila, for that wonderful talk. It's also a wonderful segue to the talk I'll be giving on the Slade. First of all, just wanted to thank the Dhaka Art Summit and MAHASSA for having me here. It's been such a pleasure, and I look forward to the next 6 days as well. So, complementary studies and decolonial unlearning at the Slade School of Fine Arts. So it's precisely the kind of things that you were talking about, Sheila, in terms of what you had hoped from Aberdeen. And I'd love to hear more during the conversation about, what the curriculum actually looked like for Aberdeen once he started. Okay, so when the Slade School of Fine Art was established in 1871 within the University of College London, it actually joined an institution that was the first university in England to admit people regardless of race or country of origin, or religion actually. And so it became a very important site for the education of ambitious students from the colonized world. Here I'm showing you some students who were very involved in nation building in their countries of origin when they returned home. Significantly, the Slade, which also accepted women from the very beginning, was established with a mandate to provide fine art training within the context of a liberal arts education, which distinguished it from the Royal Academy, founded in 1768, after the Parisian Beaux-Arts curriculum, which was the model for arts education in many places. We heard from Chương-Đài earlier about the École des Beaux-Arts in Hanoi. What I found really fascinating about Sneha's paper was the way in which the Baroda School of Fine Art also thinks about itself in very much the same way as being located within a university. So I'll be pointing at that a little bit later too. So under the direction of William Coldstream, who led the school from 1945 till 1975, the Slade developed what they thought of as a distinctive approach, which was refined into a pedagogical method that fostered intellectualism, inquiry, and interdisciplinarity in their students, which after 1960 with Coldstream Report was then disseminated to the rest of the UK. But before that, the Slade was really primarily, what made the Slade very distinctive was the way in which they incorporated what was called complementary studies into their curriculum, which basically meant art history until about 1960 when students started to take film studies as well. But they were also able to take other things like geography or history. And indeed, Coldstream's own assessment of these changes, or the intensification of art history built into the curriculum for the art school, was that, quote, the presence of art historians has enabled the students to understand the relationships between their own activities and the culture in which they live. So he was very self-conscious about this. So in commenting on the impact of the rise of art education within universities in 1960s America, the art critic Harold Rosenberg wrote the following, and this sort of points a little bit to what Sneha was speculating on in the context of Baroda. So Rosenberg writes, "New painting and sculpture, typical of the past decade, makes the spectator aware of the presence of model works that have not been so much imitated or drawn upon for imaginative hints as systematically analyzed and extended by rational inference." So basically what they're saying, what Rosenberg says is what we all would understand from a kind of intuitive perspective, that when art history has become a part of the art school curriculum, it then creates artists that are more critically engaged with the history of art, right? For students coming from the colonized decolonizing or formerly colonized worlds, the critical perspectives that they developed enabled them to see the systemic failures of a history of art and Europe's claims to universality, and it made the Slade a particularly interesting site of decolonial meaning-making. So this combination of teaching a very Eurocentric form of art history with an extremely international student body. I mean, I wouldn't overstate it, it's not extremely international, but they did have quite a few students from the decolonizing and colonized worlds. So why Slade? Why do I take this study on? What is it? Why is it important to me? It basically links to the ways in which I'm trying to rethink a global history of art, and part of the larger MAHASSA project of finding new ways to write an art history that is global, and of finding through lines that allow us to tell new stories, to make new South-South connections, to find relations, relational comparisons, and also resonances. So this is really about trying to figure out, what kinds of different ways can we find to build a new kind of global art history, and how can we write histories through what I call a global microhistory. So the Slade functions as a site of global microhistory for me, meaning that it allows us to understand questions of the global at a much, much smaller scale, so that we can be much more precise about our analyses when we think about the global history of art. So we're not just writing these big generalized pictures, but really trying to tease out what the moments of resistance, decolonization, translation, and reinvention are in the encounters between center and periphery, but also between different South-South sites. So this kind of global microhistory allows us to see the Slade as a condensed context of shared cultural infrastructure, and also maps the entanglements and common experiences that students had. So in order to theorize decolonial modernism as a phenomenon that traversed multiple national contexts rather than as separate, disconnected, multiple modernisms, I'm introducing the notion of transversals. So these are connecting lines within Euclidean geometry that create equal angles, basically congruent angles at their points of intersection with the parallel lines. So if you look here, angles 1 and 5 are congruent, 3 and 7 are congruent, so are 2 and 3. I love being a math teacher, it's very fun. But really, this is really a way for us to find ways of connecting art histories across different South-South sites, so that we don't end up with a history, as we understand it now, of dissemination from center to periphery. This allows us to see, something like a city or an art school as a transversal that then allows us to connect what seemingly was understood as parallel histories before. And so this allows us to arrive at a theory of decolonial modernism that refutes existing narratives about the dissemination of knowledge and culture from center to periphery. Okay, so Slade. Isn't it sweet? I was able to find the student photographs of all of these artists in the Slade Archives. And so, you actually get to see just what they looked like when they were emerging and sort of thinking about themselves as young artists, and thinking about, how they would present themselves. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to briefly introduce 4 Slade students from 2 generations to give us a sense of their, the complexities of their decolonial unlearning. I mean, obviously, we don't have enough time to do a very deep dive, but I think that the comparison is useful, especially in the context of MAHASSA, where we're thinking about connections and connectivities between Asia and Africa. So I'll be looking at Ben Nwanmu from Nigeria, Ibrahim El-Salahi from Sudan, Anwar Jalal Shamsa from Pakistan, and Kim Lim from Singapore. So Ben Nwanwu, you can see him in his class picture here from 1946. He's the one that's circled in the red box. He arrived in London in the summer of 1944 on a Shell Petroleum British Council scholarship. And he had both a teacher certificate and also a significant reputation as an artist in Nigeria already. So he came as a fairly fully formed artist. And yet when he arrived, he was told that he needed to take remedial classes. He wasn't very happy about this. He had to enroll in 2 terms in basic drawing, basic painting, and art history at Goldsmiths College in London. And this is something that art historian Sylvester Odbeki describes as a short but concentrated lesson in ideological reorientation. And so this brings us back to what Chung-Dai was saying about, what are the reasons why we look at art schools? And it's this Foucauldian idea of the art school as a site of ideological production and the production of citizens, of subjects, in this case, perhaps, too. Because, of course, Nigeria was still a colony at that time. So, sorry, I meant to just show you this as well when I was introducing the 4 students that I would be looking at. And you can see El-Salahi and Shemza are actually sitting next to each other in their class photo. All right, so there's Nwanwu. He began in 1945 at the wartime location of the Slade at Ruskin College in Oxford University. And he was classically trained in drawing, sculpture, painting, human anatomy, and he also took complementary studies in European art history. And so you can see from these pencil drawings that he was very much inculcated in the culture of the life drawing room when he was at the Slade, and he developed a facility for it and mastered the expected vocabularies of classical European art pedagogy. But what's interesting about his time at the Slade was that it was at this time that Nwanwu became aware of the limitations of a history of art that he had once imagined was universal, struggling with the subject. So he actually failed it the first time he took it. But when he finished his studies at the Slade, he actually did a postgraduate year. It's not as if he was resistant to study, but it was the kind of study that was being asked of him. And what he did was that he did a postgraduate year in West African ethnography. But then he was also disappointed in that because he discovered the colonial epistemologies of that discipline as well, even though it became quite useful in terms of building a vocabulary of visual resources for him. So it was in this time, Ogbeki argues, that he began to frame his work and identity as African. As opposed to Igbo or Nigerian, he really wanted to think of himself as African, and he took a political and decolonial stance against European culture in this context. And so here you can see studies for a painting, Songs of the City, which is based on the downfall of the Benin kings under British colonial rule. And then on the right, I'm also showing you how Nwanwu was actually one of the first Nigerian artists to bring, African artists to bring Africanized appropriations of Christian iconography into his work. So he was literally reclaiming the history that had been forced down his throat when he was a student. So he later in his career begins producing work like this. This is considered one of his best known works. And it's understood as an epitome of his search for a modern artistic expression of Igbo aesthetics and metaphysics. But what interests me most actually about the Slade interaction for Nwanwu is his relationship with the Slade after he left. He became a art supervisor of the Information Services Department of the Colonial Office of Nigeria. And it was in that capacity that in 1958, he writes to William Coldstream in order to investigate the ways in which the Slade was seeking to develop partnerships in Nigeria in order to develop capacity in the art schools there. And so he was inquiring in particular about the partnership that Slade was building with the Nigerian College of Zaria. And Imagining that anyone was seeking his advice, Coldstream writes this sweet note which says, you know, if there's anything you would like to discuss concerning art education, I would be very pleased to have a talk. And then Nwanwu writes back with this. He writes, there seems to be no particular need for a discussion on the subject. And then the bit that's highlighted there says, if our art does not express African characteristics, then it can play no significant role in our development as a nation. I am not sure that the entire influence of the Slade School would be a good thing. So, you know, basically he's thinking about, you know, what is the relationship between the system, the Western system of art education, which you can see earlier. Yeah, there we go. Between the Western system of art education and the development of a national language, and what does that mean in the context of art education in Nigeria? So, our second, so the second part of this talk is going to look at the three artists who were at the Slade in around 1956. As you saw, Shemza and El Salahi knew each other to a certain extent, but not very well, and Kim Lim, who was also there at the same time. So in 1957, the Slade brought together these three artists who would all go on to define visual vocabularies that at once defined and co-constituted modernism, which decentered European claims to universality and reclaimed modernism's relationship with non-Western visual practices. Can somebody tell me what time it is, please? Okay. Are we going to be going over or no? Okay. All right, so basically all of these artists were confronting their own positionalities within an art history that was being taught to them at the Slade that was very Eurocentric. And by considering them together, what I'm trying to do is to create that sort of transversal line, to understand their histories together, and to, as Shumei-Shi says, bring into relation terms that have been traditionally pushed apart from each other due to the history of European exceptionalism that undergirds Eurocentrism. So all three of these artists were taught by Ernst Gombrich, who began teaching at the Slade in 1956 after the departure of Rudolf Wittgauer. And it's true that his art history was Eurocentric, but I don't want to just reduce it to that. I think we need to complicate this story so that we're not just seeing this as a sort of knee-jerk response to Eurocentric histories. And so one thing that's really interesting is the way in which the art historian Partha Mitter describes his relationship to John Gombrich, because Mitter did his PhD with Gombrich and has some very interesting things to say about that teaching. So he points out that although Gombrich's knowledge really only extended to the history of European art, his perspective on the modern system of the arts was not epistemologically closed, and which then results in the famous opening lines of The Story of Art. There is no such thing as art, only artists, right? There is no such thing as art, only artists. So more importantly, what this means is that the idea of art is not epistemologically closed, and this for him opened the possibility of having other types of visual culture, other types of artistic production. And this is something that Gombrich takes to a sort of point of fruition in his next work, Art and Illusion, a study in the psychology of pictorial representation, which he publishes in 1960, but which he was working through from 1956 to 1958. And his lectures at the Slade were based on this book, Art and Illusion. So, you know, Mitter writes that this study of visual culture and its approach to visual forms beyond the classical canon opens critical methodologies for him. And he writes, "It was Gombrich's method that enabled me to challenge the unquestioned acceptance of the superiority of the classical canon." So for him, for Mitter, Gombrich actually provides the conditions for a questioning of what that canon actually was. So just because of time, I'm going to show you a few, I'm just going to race through this. This is El Salahi and the way he responded to the way he was being taught art history at the Slade. He says, he was told that he was very much influenced by Mondrian, so he ran over to the Tate to see some work by Mondrian, and he says he was quite sure that there was no connection between Mondrian's total abstraction and his humble attempts to compose a painting liberated from the illusion of the third dimension. So, you know, it's interesting to see how he's assimilating these structures and these reference points and trying to fit himself into these reference points. It's a little uncomfortable, but he still tries, and, you know, he says that he's haunted by the discoveries of the Renaissance era. And actually, El-Salahi, he takes the art history that he's being taught quite seriously, and really doesn't make any kind of a critical move until he goes back to Sudan, where he becomes aware of the fact that his work is not very well received, and he then becomes aware of the very colonial art history that he had been taught. And then he starts to make works that look like these, which in our MAHASSA group we were looking at a few days ago when Iftikhar Dadi brought them up in relation to Salah Hassan, and just sort of began to think about the relationships and the kind of artwork that he was making that brought together different aspects of Arabic and African art. Kim Lim is also from this group, and she commented that when I went to the Slade, there was art history where you learned that there was primitive art leading up to the kind of epitome of Western art, which is the Renaissance. And I still don't feel that way. There were other things that were equally good. So in the end, you just have to go according to your instincts. But of course, what are your instincts, right? It's not that we're born with a universal set of instincts about what is good art. And so Lim began to travel in order to get from Singapore to London, and from London back to Singapore. She would take these flights that would allow her to stop at multiple points in between, so that she would be able to explore the art and visual culture of the region, as well as of Egypt and Greece, which were on the way. So she has some beautiful photographs of her travels. So she saw her work as being in dialogue with Brancusi, and her cultural references were very complex, and they were layered through her art education, her place in the British art world, and also in a cultural claim to the journeys that took her back home every summer, which included the way there, as well as the multi-ethnic landscape of Singapore. So I think that it's important here to emphasize the journey rather than the sort of any kind of situatedness in a nation state. So she saw her relationship to the artworks that she saw on these journeys, not just as iconographical, but also articulated through space, and which was an act of emplacement and a critique of the epistemologies of display that she saw in European encyclopedic museums, which you can see here in this quote, where she talks about the way in which she experienced art in their sites. And so you can see too that her work begins to explore questions of site and boundaries, as well as making cultural references here to paper screens and walls in the context of Japan, of course. So, you know, this is what she did in order to create these notions of porosity and breaking down the distinctions between inside and outside in order to serve as a metaphor for the ways in which she constructed a visual language inflected by her complex and self-consciously decentered way of being in the world. So the last person that I will sort of talk about quickly, what time is it? Sorry? 50. Oh, I'm making good time. Okay. So Shamsa, many of you already know this story, this anecdote, where Shamsa, after coming out of a Gombrich lecture, comes out and is completely distraught by the fact that Gombrich has just told him that Islamic art is functional, and that, you know, he couldn't understand, you know, the place of Islamic art in this larger history. And so he began to destroy all his artwork afterwards, and also begins to think about new ways of coming up with a visual language. And so, you know, what happens to El Salahi and Nwanwu is that they resort to the museums, and so does Shamsa. And museums become the sanctuary from the Eurocentrism of student life and to the claims of universality that their curriculum imposed upon them. And so, you know, for Shamsa, the realization that Islamic art did not partake of the universal of European epistemologies and could not be called art because it was functional was something that was quite traumatic. But later on in his work, he begins to work through ways of having multiple layers of signification and expression in the works. So in this work, which of course becomes the cover of the other story, Shamsa actually invokes 3 different registers of mark making from the completely abstract manner that nods towards Paul Klee, which is also an important reference point for Shamsa, to the fact that this has a title. It's called The Wall. So it pulls this work back into a realm of representation. And so you have sort of a kind of figurative representation. And then the fact that once you see that it's a wall, you can think of it perhaps as being ornamented with Islamic ornamentation. So it really makes you begin to question, you know, what is the distinction made in Western modernism between abstraction and decoration in the non-Western world, when in fact it can, if you look at the same work, and it can operate on these multiple registers all at once, that you have the possibility of a hybrid language information. Okay, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. All right, so I think I just wanted to end here with a question to my fellow panelists about Baroda and about Dhaka, just really, and also Hanoi, thinking about, you know, what other pathways could we imagine, and what happens when these artists go back to their countries of origin in order to establish art schools. What happens when Subramanian goes and begins to participate in the building of the curriculum in Baroda, which, as we saw, was both very similar but extremely critical of the Eurocentrism of the curriculum at the Slade, and much more global. And then what happens when Abedin goes back from his travels. So I know we don't have much time for a discussion, but let's try. Thank you.
So it's now 7:55. We actually don't have any time almost. But maybe if the panelists can come up to the stage and we can take questions from the audience, if there are any.
Are there questions from the audience? Since I think we're going to have the ability to continue the conversation amongst ourselves. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, panelists. This was very insightful and helpful. I'll keep my question very short and maybe ask Professor Tiampo to address this. Why do you think that the figures that you've talked about who go to Slade are colonial subjects, or subjects from as like colonized subjects? Because, yeah, maybe that. Why would they represent like subjects that are colonized?
Because they were coming from colonized countries. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. So with regards to what happened in East Pakistan and then Bangladesh, I mean, my understanding of why one of the pressures on the artists was that was West Pakistani ideology, basically, which thought that people living in East Pakistan are too close to Hinduism, and that there should be a kind of a break from India. And so my question would be that it's not just that, that's actually quite a lot of pressure that is exerted on cultural forms in East Pakistan. And so the question of so triangulating three things. One would be kind of, let's say, international modernism. The second would be folk culture of East Bengal, and the third would be the Indian influence. And I think one way to situate these artists might be within these three points of reference.
Can you just ask me the question again? The last part, I think, straight the question, yeah.
Well,
I missed
it's
it.
more of a comment rather than a question. Which is
It was a much more comment, actually.
Yeah, which is to think about the reason why East Pakistani artists are trying to distinguish themselves from India, basically, is also an exertion due to the pervasive kind of dominance of Pakistani ideology, which is seeing basically East Pakistan as being too close to Hinduism. So, for example, Rabindranath, Tagore's songs was another point of censure.
Yeah, yes, you're right. I think, yes, it is right. Because nowadays, I can say there's kind of the attitudes, I will say that is an attitude, and afterwards it became something like a characteristics which actually the Muslim artists want to become and want to present in their artwork. Because how to actually distinguish from the art of India and the art of Bangladesh, there is not much more differences between the two of us. So if you just inclined yourself much more to the notions of Muslimism rather than your inclination to the Hindu art, the history, then maybe there would be an identification as Bangladeshi artists, or the art scenery would be another kind of maybe new vibrating or new kind of thing in the world. I think that kind of things also happened in the minds of the artists. Yeah, my English is not that much good, so I'm sorry I couldn't answer that much well. Okay, but I think you understood. Maybe you can explain that as well.
No, I mean,
okay.
And the other point I think between the John Tain's paper and yours is the relation of folk to folk, kind of So in other words, can really in the age of modernism can folk can the folk ever be only more than a supplement, okay, to the curriculum of art? So I think you were actually a little bit critical of Zainul Abidin, saying he was not bold enough.
No, he was not.
But I would say in response is that this was a time when you could not have a curriculum that deviated quite a bit from what was being taught at the Slade or whatever. That in fact and the folk in many of these places could only be a kind of a supplement, which is kind of barely recognized. So that happens perhaps in Dhaka with Zainul Abidin's interest in folk, but I don't know how much it's central to the curriculum, or whether it's part of field trips and so on. And Chongdoi, I mean, your discussion of lacquer is also something where you couldn't even find the name of the teacher. In Lahore, this is the case with miniature painting. Miniature painting in the 50s, 60s was the teachers were not full-fledged instructors. They were hired as kind of auxiliary teachers. So I think that the dominance of kind of modernist syllabuses, academic and modernist syllabuses, would have precluded the possibility of having a full-fledged syllabus that depended completely on perspectives that were local.
Yeah, I think I found something about in the talks of her, Sneha, what she was actually thinking about the co-curriculum activities which were actually in Baroda was happening. And we didn't have that kind of curriculum activities here. I mean, General Abidin could have done that, incorporating those folk art and also to find such, that thing actually came to my mind while I was actually criticizing him. Okay, yeah.
Yes, it was a wonderful panel. Question about Slade. Do you think there was first a question, then a comment. Do you think that there was an intentionality in being more sort of looking at diversity, as you said, you know, being willing to take those students, that there was still the colonial mindset? It sounds like there was. And then but I'd like to know your opinion. And then the comment is that it seems to me that it was a fascinating story, that it was actually the resistance against Eurocentrism that helped those students find their own voices. So in a way, it was a favor to them to see, as you say, they took refuge in museums and other ways. So I'm curious about your thoughts.
Thank you to the panel. Quick question to Sneha about Baroda. You spoke about their methods of ordering 3 periodicals and cutting the images out so that their students would have access. So I was just wondering whether there has been any work on what kind of, because in my field it becomes like an ethnographic object, and it starts to circulate among these students, perhaps even though there was a 3rd periodical, detached from its context. And I was just wondering whether that also shaped the interpretation and the way in which students interacted with these objects.
Okay, so question over here. Okay.
Hi, thank you for those really wonderful presentations. My question isn't to anyone specifically, but just maybe an observation as an artist who has been educated with a Western education, art education primarily. When I was listening to the Slade presentation specifically, these are still issues that artists deal with today very much so. Maybe the context is different because we have intellectuals, the discourse shifts into certain places, especially if you have the luxury to travel. So you've come over here, we're able to share certain kinds of knowledge and take it back with us. But my question is more that as Western institutions, museum institutions still perpetuate these kinds of thinkings in these kinds of networks and systems, how, and the few museums that I've seen actually are trying to shift this are the ones where there are very specific curators with a certain set of knowledge that they are willing to share. How, as maybe artists, I haven't gone to art school in 20 years now, but how do artists in the 21st century look at art history? How do Western education systems address the issues that you've been speaking about through this historical lack of narrative, inclusion, diversity? How do, if you have any thoughts along those lines?
So thank you. So 3 questions, 1 Slade, 1 on Baroda and photos, and then the 3rd for the general.
I don't really think that, I should probably look a little bit farther into the reasons why Slade decided, or rather the University College of London decided that they wanted to accept students of any race or religion. I'm unfortunately not aware of the reason for that. And then as for doing these students a favor, I don't think that we can really be thinking in those terms, and this sort of connects to the last question, which is, you know, how is it that we can better serve students by creating narratives that they can connect with, and find a voice that isn't necessarily oppositional, because it's a pretty difficult place to be in, where you have to, if every conversation or every artwork you make has to start with trying to negate how you've been educated, then that's not going to be particularly conducive to creating new narratives. So I think fora like this are really important, and I'm just going to stop there. We can talk more. I've got lots of thoughts on this.
Yeah, Debbie. The Faculty of Fine Arts, like many other art institutions of the time, in India, actually, it went through this period, I think, particularly from the 50s to about 70s, of ordering journals from all over. And language was, but from the Western world, in a sense. So, so you would find a periodical section which would have entire sort of, issues of magazines like Span and, absolutely sort of like, things that were published in French and so on. And these were ordered sort of almost en masse. And you find them in libraries, whether you go to the National Gallery of Modern Art, whether you go to the Lalit Kala Academy, whether you go to art schools very often. And I think that those reading practices very much sort of just seeing and reading all of those things sort of informed, I think, as much sort of visual sensibility as it did sort of when, say, in the Faculty of Fine Arts, images from those were cut out and placed there. But I think, I think therefore journals and so on, of course, institutions collecting them played a huge role, but also then artists editing and sort of circulating their own sort of journals also played, I think, a huge role in informing sort of, their sensibilities, conversations, etc. I think Ming has sort of spoken about this earlier as well, of the journal becoming, by default, it is this portable thing, and therefore one is able to sort of send it across. And at one level, in English language, there's one thing that goes on, but I think if you start looking at sort of other Indian languages, for instance, there are many other circuits that you see that start forming, and sort of many other, let's say, milieus within which these people are speaking in. So for instance, if I can take the example of an artist like Ghulam Sheikh, he edited or co-edited a bilingual sort of art journal called Vrishchik. And Vrishchik was widely circulated to artists and, sort of critic friends within India, but also sort of others with whom, they had sort of, they'd built relationships outside. But Ghulam Sheikh also wrote poetry and short stories in Gujarati. And in fact, in the Gujarati milieu, was better known as a poet, or perhaps first known as a poet and a short story writer, and then as a painter. And so those, I think, milieus were also, I think, differently constructed. I'm not sure I've understood if that's what you were asking, but if not, maybe you could just.
We are almost out of time, but as a beginning of an answer, maybe we can say that, I think the question of how to make effects shift and change within the schools, I think part of this, you're right, the schools continue to have this problem, and I think we'll continue to have this problem as many schools seek students in the West, in the UK or the US, for instance, seek students from outside Europe or America, and there's an increasing kind of, especially in the US, there's a reliance on art students from outside the US for tuition, right? And I think part of the solution or the kind of the shift will happen when the students themselves really kind of demand that kind of change. I think that's starting to happen. I think schools themselves, at least some schools, are starting to kind of make shifts in terms of faculty that they hire, in terms of who they are kind of including in their circles to kind of be part of that conversation. So, but we can talk more about this maybe.
Can I just add one
Yeah.
thing? There's so much to talk about on this level, but I just think that it's important also to remember that the kinds of work that we're doing here in this context and in a few other contexts in terms of changing the ways in which we tell and display the history of art are really quite far at the forefront of the discussions about what it means to world art history. What does it mean not to globalize, meaning that you would just sort of create more things from around the world around a center, but really to world it from multiple perspectives. This is something that's just being done now. And for the idea, in order to really change things at the level of the art schools and at the level of universities, one of the things that we've been thinking for years, Iftikhar and I, is that we really need to build a textbook so that people, teaching art history in Kansas can do it easily and can have the resources that are necessary to write something, to teach a more global history of art.
Okay, and on
Which
that,
would then go into museum.
yeah, and on that note, we are going to have to conclude because I think there's people waiting for us. So thank you all for coming to this panel, and hope to see you at our subsequent events, and enjoy the summit. Thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists.